The Diablo 2 Necromancer is one of the most unique classes in Diablo 2, and while the Necromancer is personally one of my favorite classes, his strength has been all over the place since Diablo 2 released, ranging from overpowered meta class to the most underpowered class in the game. As it stands though, as of 1.14, the Necromancer is a solid mid-range class with a decent amount of power and a lot of interesting ways of delivering it. Stat-wise, the Necromancer starts out as a fairly obvious caster, though with a pinch of extra dexterity, sitting at 15 strength, 25 dexterity, 15 vitality, and 25 energy, and growth of a similar vein sitting at 1.5 life per level and 2 per point in vitality, as well as 2 mana per level and 2 per point in energy, so fairly straightforward with the intent for the most part. As far as his breakpoints, those tend to fall into the mildly disappointing category, with extremely slow blocking and hit recovery speeds, and good but not sorceress good casting speeds, meaning the Necromancer generally needs to pay a little more attention to his breakpoints and such whenever you're planning a build or planning the equipment for a build. While all of that sounds a bit down on the Necromancer, it is compensated for with his extremely interesting tool bag of skills, which are split between the damage-oriented Poison and Bone tree, the minion-focused Summoning tree, and the support-focused Curse tree, culminating in a character that can play a lot of different roles and can be played with a lot of different twists, even within a given build archetype. In the Curse tree, we have control curses on the left and utility on the right. In the underused but extremely potent control branch, you have Dim Vision, which afflicts normal enemies with a temporary blind effect, inhibiting their AI behavior to only melee range functions. You can actually get this function with a few different weapons as well. Blinding hit. But anyway, next up you have Confuse, which causes normal enemies to break AI behavior and treat everyone else as if they're enemies to be attacked. Confuse actually resists being overridden by effects such as Fear and Blind, which is making it a little bit unique compared to other curses. And actually kind of leads into finally the last one, which is Attract, which causes the cursed creature to be a valid target for any nearby creature, and also makes the creature attack other nearby creatures as well. Note, it does not break targeting AI, so enemies will generally target the nearest opponent, so it is only of limited use, and you have to kind of choose when you need to use it, but it is also, like Confuse, cannot be overridden by things. In fact, it cannot be overridden at all, making it kind of useful in heavy curse parties or parties where you have a lot of on-strike curse casting. As far as the utility curses, there is one thing we do have to specify first, and that is whenever we say -%, it is subtractive, not multiplicative. So minus 50% from 20% would be a negative 30%, not 10%. That out of the way, from top to bottom we have Amplify Damage, which reduces the target's physical resistances by 100%, Weaken, which weakens enemy attacks by 33% for its duration, Iron Maiden, which causes the enemy to hurt themselves whenever they deal melee damage, Terror, which is essentially just the fear effect in an AoE that you can drop wherever you want, and is primarily only used for clearing minions away from bosses for boss farming, Life Tap, to an extremely, is pretty much a super powerful skill in the right circumstances or useless in others. Basically, it restores life based on physical damage dealt, and as such can allow leech-like effects even whenever leech would otherwise be impossible, such as on skeletons or through various skills like Smite. Decrepify, which is an odd mix of weaken and amplify damage with a slow added to it. Basically, it provides a 50% reduction in a lot of things. Basically, physical damage, physical resist, attack speed, and movement speed on the target are all reduced by just 50%, making it easily one of the best curses of, if I only have to choose one that I'm going to use consistently, this is going to be the one I'm going to go for, but thankfully you can kind of swap between curses as the need arises. And last but not least, down here at the very bottom is Lower Resist, which lowers enemy resistances to fire, lightning, cold, and poison, which is what differentiates it from Conviction. It is worth noting that it is, out of all the things, the only thing that can actually break poison immunity as well. It is worth noting that, yeah, whenever they are breaking immunities, though, they only do it at, I believe it's 1/5 the rate, so very reduced numbers. So if an enemy has, say, 120% resistance to something, you're not going to be able to break that. Next up, we have the more direct method for the Necromancer, that is the Poison and Bone tree, with poison on the left, bone and damage in the middle, and bone control on the right. While the Poison branch is often overlooked, it does actually have some decent utility. You have Poison Dagger that deals poison damage, obviously, but also increases the attack rating of a dagger attack, giving melee Necromancers an option for improving their accuracy if they want to use a dagger specifically. There are other types of melee necromancers as well, but they can't take advantage of this. Next is Poison Explosion with high poison damage, but unfortunately also a high duration on it. As you level it up, it just keeps increasing. It would be useful for corpse removal, but the normal corpse explosion fills that role better. And finally, Poison Nova, easily the best poison skill in the entire game. Able to get up to high poison damage numbers while being locked to a short 2-second duration. This makes it exceptionally powerful when combined with lower resist and the use of synergies. Though it does still take some getting used to use effectively, it can be extremely devastating to large groups of enemies. In the bone damage branch, here in the middle, we have a great source of pure magic damage for the most part. While there is no way to reduce enemy resistances to pure magic, very few enemies are actually immune to it or resistant to it, meaning it's one way to bypass most of the annoyances related to immunities in the game, with the exception of one particular enemy near the end of the game. But anyway, up top we have Teeth, a shotgun-style magic spell that functions kind of like the Amazon multi-shot, albeit magic, not physical. It is worth noting that only one tooth can hit a single target in a spray, so you can't really stack them up very well, so you kind of have to use them versus groups rather than versus individuals for it to be any real use. Skipping down past the obvious, we move on to Bone Spear, which is my personal preference for bone magic since it deals a reasonable amount of damage, has a fast travel speed, auto-pierces targets, letting you damage multiple enemies at once, and it's just an all-around just good general use skill, and it's relatively cheap to use compared to the higher hitting alternative that is right below it, Bone Spirit. Bone Spirit's an auto-tracking bone magic that will follow a target and deal a reasonable amount of damage to them. And it tracks, and it also travels a little bit slower than Bone Spear, unfortunately. It used to be a lot better, but they removed a thing called corner shooting, basically where you would shoot it and it would track something that you couldn't have a direct line of sight to. For example, if you had Diablo stuck on a corner, you could actually shoot it around that corner. But now you actually have to have a line of sight to them, so it makes it a little bit less useful. So yeah, you just need that line of sight, and that just removed a lot of its utility, making it the debate between Spear and Spirit slightly less contentious. I personally find the cheaper Bone Spear, even though it does less absolute damage, to be a little bit more reasonable for me. And here on the right, we have the Bone Control, or Bone Summons, depending on whichever you want to call them. They are just the bone stuff that you summon out that don't do damage. At the top, we have Bone Armor that absorbs incoming physical damage before it reaches your life pool. Basically, it is the same thing as the Druid Cyclone Armor. That Cyclone Armor protects against elemental, this protects against physical. They're both really good skills. Definitely worth putting at least a point in. Well, actually, I would just put 1 point into this one because you have Bone Wall and Bone Prison, and we'll cover why in just a second. But Bone Wall it summons a literal wall of bone that limits enemy movement. It's just a straight line. It works as it says on the tin, and it's exceptionally good at blocking or forming choke points for enemies to go through, so you can kind of channel them into your Bone Spear or Spirit or whatever you want to be shooting at them, or you can trap them and do a Poison Nova and they can't really move anywhere. Bone Prison, which is below that, summons a circular bone structure around the target, sometimes locking them in. If there's like terrain or anything in the way, it sometimes janks up and they can walk around it. It can get awkward, especially whenever there's multiple enemies, because it can cast the bone wall around them and there can be a gap around the backside of it where there were enemies following them, and then they'll just walk back out the backside and get straight to you. So I generally prefer wall being on that, but Prison and Wall are exceptional synergy investments because, as I was kind of hinting at earlier, they not only boost bone damage spells and each other, but they also boost bone armor more than points in the armor itself. They give, if I remember correctly, a 15 boost to the bone armor whereas points in the bone armor itself only give 10. Last but not least, and no, I didn't forget it, Corpse Explosion, a skill that has been nerfed so many times it's crazy, but it's still oddly powerful. Basically takes the corpse's base life and causes it to explode, dealing fire and physical damage to nearby enemies. Really good with amp damage, by the way, or sometimes lower resist, depending on what you're dealing with. But yeah, more points into it just increase the radius, so even at 1 point, it's still going to be fairly effective against tightly packed enemies, but if you're wanting to deal with like large groups of enemies, you're going to have plus skills in it or extra points into it. It's extremely deadly on players 1, but still usable on players 8, even though due to nerfs, it does not scale with player difficulty. So on player 8, it's doing damage based on the base life of the monster. So it's not based on the boosted life that the player's count actually causes to it. And the last tree we'll look at is the Summon Tree, a tree that at first looks newbie friendly, but is more of a trap than anything for new players since, other than golems, it generally doesn't shine unless you have a lot of plus skills. The tree is split a bit weird as well. You have a skeleton driven and a golem driven section, but there's some things that work on certain things and not others. And yeah, it gets a little bit convoluted, but yeah, it's a very interesting tree. In the Skeleton branch, we have Skeleton Mastery. That buffs all the summons in the Skeleton branch, that upside down L that we have here, which includes Raised Skeleton, which summons skeletons that perform melee attacks and are decent enough tanks and distractions. Raised Skeleton Magi, which summons ranged elemental skeletons that deal one of the 4 main elements in damage, which are poison, cold, lightning, and fire. Only one each, unfortunately. Their damage is really underwhelming, but they can be used for some utility, especially a couple poison and cold mages. If you are still able to get enough corpses, the cold mages can actually help you control a battle, whereas the poison ones will actually keep enemies from triggering their passive heal effect that is annoying as sin. And at the bottom we have Revive, which is based off the Skeleton branch as well, due to its buffs, but lets you revive fallen enemies to join your army for a limited amount of time. This can be a bit more useful as you can revive enemies with various skills like Crushing Blow, Inferno, different elements of damage, or even immunities in some cases. In the Golem branch, you have, well, golems, as should be relatively obvious. Golem Mastery, of course, boosts them all. Clay Golem slows enemies. Blood Golem shares life and leeches life for better or worse, so it can actually end up hurting you if you summon it in the wrong situation. Iron Golem takes a piece of metal equipment and turns it into a golem with most of its related effects. Some of them don't get actually passed on, like the Amazon armor won't summon a Valkyrie off of your golem, for example. But it also gets a personal thorns skill, which is just thorns but with 0 radius on it. So basically, anything that hits that gets the thorns effect. And Fire Golem, which is a tanky golem with a holy fire aura. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward. And also, whenever the Fire Golem dies, it explodes. So it's basically a Final Fantasy bomb. But you can only have one golem active at a time, so they do provide passive bonuses to each other through synergies. You just kind of have to choose which one you want to kind of aim for. The most popular ones are usually Iron Golem and Clay Golem with a little bit of Fire Golem. The Iron Golem is usually popular because, well, you can throw that piece of equipment on it and have some kind of fun side effects. The Clay Golem is super popular because it can slow things down to a crawl, making bosses a joke. And yes, it does slow them whenever it's hit as well. And the Fire Golem is just popular because, well, PvP is sometimes a thing, and it used to be a little bit of a prank to pull that on there. It's not good enough to do that nowadays, though. Finally, we have Summon Resist, which boosts all the resistances of your golems and skeletons. It is important to remember that's just your golems and skeletons. It does not boost the resists of your off-class summons, like if you can summon a Valkyrie or wolves or any of the spirits. It does not give them resistances or any kind of buff, and it does not work on your revives. This is actually for balance reasons, because then you could actually have some insane immunities and resistances on the revives that would make them nearly immortal. So, yeah. While not really ideal for a first-time player, the Necromancer can be a beast with a variety of builds. He's just not top tier in any individual one, in my opinion. He's still my favorite class, though, but he's best saved for your second or third outing unless you're super interested in a very specific build that has lower equipment requirements. Like, I would not go for a summoner starting out with a Necromancer, but you could get away with a Bone Necromancer, because those can get away with slightly cheaper stuff, and a lot of their stuff can be shopped.